In 1857, a large portion of land in central Manhattan was purchased for the construction of a public park in one of the largest, fastest growing and most densely populated cities in history, New York. When it opened in 1876, the 843-acre park not only provided some much-needed breathing space for millions of New Yorkers, but it quickly set the standard for urban parks all around the world. Using natural lines, organic topography, and a distinct lack of symmetry, Central Park sits juxtaposed to the harsh street grid system of Manhattan's urban world. It's the perfect public park, large enough and picturesque enough to escape the concrete and steel mania of the modern world. Now, it's widely acknowledged that Central Park's natural, free-flowing design gets its inspiration from two sources. One, the rolling hill landscaped cemeteries that were popping up across the eastern United States at the time, and here, an unassuming little park in the north of England, in the busy port town of Birkenhead on the Wirral Peninsula. So how did Birkenhead Park go on to inspire the greatest city park on Earth? The story starts back in the early part of the 19th century, when places in England were becoming rapidly industrialised, and urban centres such as Manchester, London, Birmingham and Liverpool were experiencing population booms like never seen before. With more and more people leaving the countryside and moving into the towns and cities, looking for work in mills, factories, mines, railways and warehouses, several new problems emerged. And at the top of them all was the problem of population density. More and more people living in smaller and smaller spaces. It impacted health and it impacted happiness. And with it came a crisis in disease and mortality. By the 1840s, some people had started to suggest that parks might offer a solution. It wasn't a popular idea at first, as most wealthy people could afford to live outside of the cities and had private parks they could retreat to where poor people weren't allowed. But the idea of open spaces for everybody began to gain momentum. It was argued that parks could improve the health and mental well-being of the general working population. A space for recreation. In 1841, a Birkenhead industrialist by the name of William Jackson had witnessed his town go from being a small rural settlement, cut off from the busy port of Liverpool by the River Mersey, to being an important shipbuilding town, industrialising and growing at an incredible rate. Fearful that the town would lose its green space entirely, Jackson proposed the creation of a public park, and the project was officially sanctioned by local government. They bought 226 acres of marsh just outside the town and handed the reins over to a man called Joseph Paxton. Paxton had developed his reputation as head gardener at Chatsworth House, probably the finest landscape garden in England at the time. He'd also become fascinated with the use of greenhouses, which eventually led him to designing the famous Crystal Palace in London. Around this time, parks and gardens were heavily influenced by the idea that symmetry is beautiful. Many country estates at the time incorporated symmetry into their natural landscapes. Parks were similar. Fountains, paths, trees, flowers. Anything that could be mirrored usually was. But Paxton tackled Birkenhead Park differently. Going for a more natural look, he curved every path, added two smaller asymmetrical lakes rather than one bigger one, and rather than having a single large lawn, he created several smaller ones surrounded by trees. Hundreds of tons of earth from the creation of the lakes were used to create hills and rockeries. The park also included several fascinating pieces of architecture, of styles from around the world, such as the Roman boathouse, the Gothic lodge, the Grand Entrance Arch, and the Swiss Bridge, which remains the only covered bridge in the UK of traditional wooden construction. It took over 1,000 men over 3 years to build the park. But when it opened in 1847, over 10,000 people attended the opening ceremony, and Birkenhead could breathe once more. The park quickly gained admirers, not least a man named Frederick Olmsted, a landscape architect from the United States who arrived in Liverpool by ship in 1850. Paying a visit to see the park, Olmsted was delighted by the curving lines, the varying surface, the colourful flowers and the shrubs, and the organic vistas that presented themselves at unexpected places. In Birkenhead, Olmsted had seen an important idea in action, that a park could be well structured, functional and attractive, and yet still maintain a natural look, as if a piece of countryside had simply been fenced and protected. By the time Birkenhead Park had been finished, the need for a public park in Manhattan had reached critical mass. Between the mid-1820s and 1855, New York City's population nearly quadrupled, expanding up the island street by street, avenue by avenue. At the time, city planners had only set aside a small number of parks and squares for recreation, the biggest of which was Battery Park. But by the 1840s, calls for a proper city park were growing louder. Eventually, a large rectangular site was picked between 59th and 106th Streets and 5th and 8th Avenues, with the Croton Reservoir near its centre. A competition was held for its design, which anyone could enter. One entry came from Frederick Olmsted and his friend Calvert Vaux. And significantly, they won. In their design, Central Park would have curved paths, asymmetrical bodies of water, and several smaller lawns surrounded by carefully placed trees and woodlands. Its topography would be altered to create hills, rock outcrops, gardens, and valleys. Only one traditional park element was added, the straight mall, leading to a terrace and a fountain. The park even included buildings and follies of different architectural styles, including bridges, a boathouse, and a castle. In every way, Central Park is Birkenhead Park on a supersized scale. At 750 acres, construction of the new Central Park cost nearly $7.5 million, which is more than the US would pay for Alaska a few years later. It also meant the eviction of over 1,500 people already living there, including residents of a village called Seneca, founded and largely occupied by free black landowners. Still, Central Park was immediately popular with the wealthy and the working classes, even before its completion in 1876. While carriage rides were common for those rich enough to afford them, for ordinary working people, Central Park was a place for courting couples, playing children, ice skating, sports, and public gatherings. After a potted history of decline and revival, today Central Park is immensely popular. This is where New Yorkers of all stripes come to have fun, to recreate. It's bright, it's colourful, it's picturesque, and most importantly, it doesn't feel rigid like the streets around it. It's stylish, it's photogenic, and it's iconic. And it remains even today a benchmark of public and civic spaces, enjoyed by people from all over the world, like it always has been. And it owes a lot of that success to a little park in northern England, the first publicly funded civic park in the world.